I don't know how to introduce Michael Noel. I suppose if you don't know who he is, you'll definitely know who he is now. He's a veteran. He's been around for as long as I can remember, since I started getting into the community. He was already a veteran. He's not that old. I think he's younger than I am. And he'll be presenting a session titled Securing IT Against Modern Threats with Microsoft Cloud Security Tools. And it's over to you, Mike.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that intro, Al. It's been a while, and it looks like you've grown a little bit of facial hair in the meantime. But I think we all handle quarantine in our own ways. So, in any case, it is the top of the hour, so I am going to jump right into this here. Please let me know, Al, if there's any problems with audio, video, what have you. But I'm assuming all is good.
Yeah, we're all good.
All right, let's go. This particular session today is essentially on the tools that I have been using for about the last year at a lot of different clients that I work directly with. I've been dealing a lot with the security stack, so that's effectively what we're going to be talking about today. And I just wanted to point out, if you hadn't already noticed it, Microsoft is renaming that old the SharePoint conference to the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference, and that'll be held next year in March. So, assuming, of course, all goes well, we're all off lockdown by that time. I really hope so. Thank you to the sponsors. Without them, they couldn't make this happen. So, of course, we are very, very thankful that they came out and sponsored the event. Al did introduce a little bit about what I've done. Let me give you a little bit more background as well, too. One of the things that I've done up till about, let's say, 4 months ago is travel the world, speaking at different events. If you can kind of see there, I used Microsoft's Power BI to create a kind of a little heat map of different places around the world that I've spoken at. And so, as you can tell, I have gotten around a little bit. Travel's kind of a secret pleasure of mine, in addition to, of course, evangelizing Microsoft products. I've been doing that for quite some time. So each one of those spots indicates the location I've physically spoken at. Hasn't happened recently. I've done a few virtual events, including this one. At some point in the future, I hope to come back to your neck of the woods and go and explore a little bit more. But in the meantime, we'll do this all through the wonderful world of the internet. Microsoft is also giving away an Oculus Quest, so keep that in mind if you go through the raffle. Okay. And please consider donating to coronavirus charity relief funds. Microsoft kind of asked us to throw these decks together. Of course, it's always a good thing to donate. I've been actually donating one of my computer's spare cycles. There's a program called Folding at Home. But in any case, I'm going to jump right into the session now that I've done the obligatory intro slides here. One of the things that's I've noticed over the past couple of years is that IT security has really fundamentally changed the way that it's operated and the way that the attackers go about their business. It is a much more sophisticated environment back there, in the hacking area. It used to be that we had people that were sitting on the side doing their little script kiddie things, trying to get in, break in through firewalls. Occasionally they got in, they did some damage. That's fundamentally changed now. We're getting to the point where really it's now you have state-sponsored attacks. You have organizations that are looking to profit off of people. They're looking to hack into databases that contain information that can be used to do things like, apply you for unemployment and send all that money over to bank accounts in different locations. That's of course all recent, but that's been going on for a while. So we're starting to see things like targeted attacks. And most organizations, you may notice that the hackers used to just go out and try to get anybody to click on something. Well, now a lot of times they're actually going out specifically looking for the CEOs, the managing directors, or the people, the finance people, the people that can initiate large money orders and that type of things. and they're targeting them with specific attacks. We call that spear phishing because they go and deliberately try to get that executive or that financial person to actually go through and click on that link. At the same time, I mentioned there's a lot of state-sponsored attacks out there right now. The most famous one might be the North Korea Sony attack, but there's other ones that are out there as well too. There's Sea Turtle. There are various nations that have felt that it's useful to be able to gather information from other, get IP from other organizations through hacking efforts. As well, we start to see a lot more of intellectual property gets lost or is stolen. So, of course, the traditional way of people to think about that is you got the guy who's working for a company and gets disgruntled and goes and downloads everything off the file server and sends it out, sends it out in the outside or leaks that information. This is like the Snowden type of examples. But the reality is that when you actually look at the statistics, the majority of that type of IP loss is actually accidental. So it's somebody on the in the sales team emailing a confidential spreadsheet out to the wrong Michael on the outside. And I say that because having a name like Michael, this has happened quite a bit to me. I get the quarterly sales number for some company, and I say, I don't think you meant to send it to this Michael. You meant to send it to someone else. So, that kind of things where, you're accidentally sending it out, or, in today's modern day of Office 365 and convenience and being able to just click a link and share something, sometimes people tend to overshare things. So they send the link to the wrong person, or they don't lock the link down to specific people, but create a link that anybody can see, and it accidentally spills outside of the target audience. So that's again what I call oversharing. So those types of things, those attacks are happening more and more often. At the same time, we're starting to see massive data integrity challenges. You've probably heard of the ransomware attacks. Those hit organizations across the board. And basically, it's a fairly straightforward type of attack. You just need to gain access to someone who has right capabilities on a file share or on some other source that's within the organization. Get them to click on the wrong link. It opens up an executable. That executable goes out and tries to then encrypt everything across their entire network. If you can get lucky enough through spear phishing to get someone who's a domain admin, guess what? You can now infect every machine within their entire domain, and someone comes in the next morning and finds a screen that says, "Hey, you've got to pay me a certain amount of Bitcoin to unlock everything," or you're out of luck. And we see that happening, by the way, not just with large organizations, but even small companies, small organizations. There was a bunch of city governments in Texas that got hit all at the same time, and they effectively had to restore everything from scratch. Everybody was writing, the police departments were writing paper tickets, and everybody was going back to old school way of doing things for those type of organizations. So we see that type of thing happen all the time. And at the same time, not to scare you or anything, but one of the downsides to moving to the cloud is there's really no backup of data, at least not natively in most cloud environments. So, when you go into Office 365, for example, it's great. You have you can recover files, natively because they're stored in recycle bin. You've got this massive file size. Again, a lot of great things about it, but at the same time, it actually only takes a single line in PowerShell to permanently delete data out of someone's mailbox if someone has access to that. Or there's been actual people that have proven that you can actually even cryptographically encrypt all of someone's mail files. So you can do kind of a cryptojacking type of ransomware attack against someone's email. And if it's not being backed up, let's say to some other additional file service, you can actually have that be permanently deleted. There's no backup. You can't go to the Exchange 5.5 backup tapes like you used to be able to. Not that that was really fun to do, but at least you had that option. At the same time, theft of devices, someone losing their laptop. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we kind of have a problem of people breaking windows of cars and taking things out of the back. So you generally know not to leave things. Some people who visit here don't always know that. They leave their laptops in the back. Guess what? It's gone. You see that happen a lot where suddenly, hey, I wanted to make sure that the data that's on there has been properly encrypted. And if it hasn't been, guess what? That gets out there. interesting. My brother actually works in Air Force IT, and he did his one of his theses on. They went out to flea markets all around the world, and they just gathered up hard drives, and the amount of data that was on there that was unencrypted was astonishing, and a lot of it was really confidential data. And so they were doing this analysis of what was out there. So keep that in mind. You know, you got to encrypt stuff if it's going to be on hard drives, and you know, delete your hard drives before you send them out there as well too. Malware, keyboard loggers, rootkits, these types of things have been out there previously, but they're starting to become more and more common. And not only that, they're starting to be much easier to use. So you can actually subscribe on what they call the dark web to various services that give you these turnkey solutions. I mean, these are very professionally done solutions. Actually had a client once where a spear phishing attack targeted the managing director, the CEO, and he didn't click on it, but we went and looked at the link, and when we followed the link back, we found that it was one of those very professional tools, but the hacker hadn't actually activated it. So even if they had clicked on it, they needed an activation link, and I thought that was kind of interesting. The guy went to all that effort to target the guy, and he forgot to activate his tool that was out there. But again, very professional tools. Deploys out things. You can see through someone's webcam. You can see everything that they're typing in, and without the ability to be able to see that on these systems, you really are opening yourself up to different hacks. So, you know, at the same time that this is happening, all of IT is getting overwhelmed. You know, you've seen the situation where, hey, you've got too much work to do. There's too many systems out there. You can't monitor them all. And in a lot of cases, you know, you may have alerts being generated by your firewall, by your, you know, you've got these sys logs. All these logs are going into these locations where people aren't looking at them because, you know, the signal to noise ratio is just, it's too challenging to be able to determine, you know, what's something that I need to focus on versus what's just a bunch of garbage alerts. And that makes it hard to stay one step ahead of these attackers because, again, these are professionals. They're getting paid to do this. So, you know, it leads to one interesting thing about the way that we do security in IT today is that the reality is that most people, and I would say upwards of 80% or even more, and I'm including IT people, don't do your passwords in the right way. And one of the reasons for this is that many people don't realize that one of the most key factors in your password is not necessarily how long it is, not necessarily how complicated it is in terms of how many uppercase, lowercase, and while that's important, you don't want a 6-character password that's all lowercase, right? Because that can be guessed through brute force attacks. One of the biggest things is your password needs to be unique, and it needs to be unique across the entire internet. People, especially your end user community, the people that we support, you know, they're overwhelmed. And you know, the reality is that they may have 2, 3, 4 passwords that they use, and they reuse those passwords. We've got to get into the situation though where people are not reusing their corporate credentials. Corporate credentials have to be unique because if they're not, what ends up happening, and this is a common situation, this happens over and over and over, it happens daily, hourly, is that, you know, the user reuses their corporate password on some external website. And mind you, this may be something that the corporation wants them to use. It may be a service that they need to sign up with. They create a user account. Well, since this is used for my work, they use your, you know, bob@companyabc.com, and they reuse the same password so they don't have to remember the passwords. Well, then some guy comes along, hacks the password database at that application, and dumps that stuff out in the dark web, right? So all of a sudden now, the next time someone tries to go hack, they have a bunch of viable passwords where they can try to go and get your corporate credentials because they have your username, which, you know, and if you're using Office 365, all they have to do is go to portal.office.com. They can punch that in, and they can try a couple of these passwords. So, and by the way, they get really sophisticated with the way they try now. Now they've learned not to try too many times on one account. They actually only try 2 or 3 times on one account and then move on to the next one. So again, that's trying to keep it so that they don't get blocked automatically by the anti-hacking protocols. So you know, the fact that a lot of these passwords aren't unique ends up, you know, being that you know, like I said, you are very susceptible to having someone be able to hack and get in if you just are using username and password. This is why we always recommend using multi-factor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But consider the use, by the way, for your own password. What I like to do is I use passphrases. So that's something that's a bunch of unique seed words. That's actually easier for you to remember, but it's extremely, extremely difficult to crack that kind of stuff. And there is, by the way, these white hat sites that will actually allow you to test out the effectiveness of your password. So there's one run out of Australia called haveitbeenpwned.com. That's the one I use. You can test your passwords against that. Be cautious, of course, about testing them anywhere else. You don't want to just suddenly throw out all your passwords that you're using, but that will tell you if the password itself is unique. So, where we're driving at here is that a lot of the times that front door being open like this, where someone can get in, someone can guess someone's password. And remember, a lot of times you have hundreds, if not thousands of people working within your organizations. If you don't have MFA turned on, eventually someone's going to be able to guess someone's password. I hate to think, some of these passwords, by the way, considering that this is, let's see, this is spring. I guarantee you one of the most common passwords today is spring 2020 with a capital S. That's actually true. And guess what it's going to be in summer? It's going to be summer 2020. People are bad with creating their passwords. But what ends up happening is they guess the passwords, they get into the environment, and then they start doing lateral attacks. And lateral attacks means, hey, I've gotten into this one system. Now I'm going to see what this system has access to, and I'm going to try to exploit that. I'm going to exploit that in multiple ways. One of the ways that a lot of people don't realize, even a lot of admins don't realize, is if you as a admin, let's say you're a domain admin even, you go and you log in on Joe user's computer because you're fixing something, whatever it is, you're fixing their printer. You go and you log in, hey, I've fixed your problem. I'm going to walk away. Well, you've just left your cached credentials on that machine. If Joe user is an admin and someone managed to control their system through some malware or some, they spear phish them or whatever it is, one of the first things they do is they use a lot of these paid for hacking tools to go in and attempt to then brute force the password, your admin passwords on these machines. Now, given that they have local access to the machines, they can bypass a lot of the protections in place. So for example, if you try to, just Control Alt Delete, walk up to a workstation and enter in someone's password, eventually you'll notice it slows down the amount of time when you can do this. That's a natural thing to disallow someone from entering in a bunch of different options. Once you gain access to a system, though, and you can gain access to the password hash files, you can then speed up that process. So these tools do that, and they can crack on a much faster basis. So they try to then crack an account that has domain admin rights within your domain. Again, if that domain admin logged into your workstation, it's very feasible that they can gain access in a very short period of time, unless you have a very long passphrase as part of your password, and it's something that's globally unique, because one of the first things they do is they attempt all 700 million passwords in that dark web database. By the way, it may sound like a lot, but it takes modern computers about 3 seconds to go through 700 million calculations, maybe even less in some cases. So they start with that, then they start brute force attacking those databases. So once they do that and they get domain admin rights, they can do a crazy amount of things. They can start to do things like golden ticket attacks. That actually creates Kerberos tickets which don't ever expire. So you actually can create this ticket which can gain access as a domain admin account, gain access to everything. And even if someone changes the password on the account, it doesn't matter because it's an unexpiring ticket. So, this kind of thing we see all the time. We see it more and more often, and you really need some type of tool to be able to protect you against that type of thing. So, what is the solution to all of this? We have an incredible amount of issues, and they're all flying at us, and we need a suite of tools to help with these issues. And so what Microsoft did is they created a sequence of tools. And I've made an attempt in my research to match up those tool sets to what's called the National Institute of Security and Technology Cybersecurity Framework. So that's kind of a framework of how you deal with different issues within your environment. So identifying when there's a problem, protecting against it, detecting that there's an issue, responding to those issues, and then recovering. Now, there is some overlap, and if I was to make this a perfect diagram, I'd kind of show where some of the overlap is, but in general, I've kind of categorized these various tools into the various areas here, and we'll talk about the majority of these tools here. Now, in true Microsoft fashion, you have to dive into the details. There's a lot of specifics as far as, okay, what the nomenclature is, the way that they're naming these things, and Microsoft has been renaming these tools as well as we go along. So it's tough enough for us, even people that are using this on a daily basis, to keep up with a lot of these naming conventions. But we will look through these various tools and how then they can be used to protect your environment, starting with one of my favorite tools. And this is, the acronym for this is MCAS. This is Microsoft Cloud App Security. This is by far probably the most useful tool that I've been using for the past year and a half at various client sites. So when they're licensed for this, we highly recommend they turn it on. The signal to noise ratio is actually quite good in this. You don't necessarily get alerts unless they're actually actionable and real alerts that you want to be taking a look at. And they tell you an incredible amount of things about the types of activities that your users are doing. Now, interestingly enough, from a privacy perspective, you can actually turn on, there's a setting within MCAS to anonymize this so that you're not actually seeing that Joe user shared a specific file, but that X user did. You can unmask that user at some point, but for privacy reasons, sometimes you don't necessarily want you want your admins to see all of that stuff. But we do in the clients where we have this turned on, we pretty much have investigations that get kicked off on the actionable evidence that comes out through MCAS. So it'll tell them, hey, we just noticed that that this user downloaded a large amount of data off of SharePoint Online and then uploaded a large amount of data into Dropbox, which is outside of our control. So you'll see that show up as an alert. As well, you'll see, hey, this user logged in from what we call a risky IP address. Maybe it's a different country that they haven't logged in with. Maybe it's a anonymous Tor-based IP address. Maybe it's another, like if you're using a third-party VPN solution, sometimes that will trigger things. And personally, I've been known to trigger these a few times within our own corporate environment because of the travel I've done. So occasionally, if I show up in Sudan or something, it'll trigger alerts. But a lot of times you'll find out, this is the way that we find out, for example, that someone's credentials have been compromised, because they'll show up and say, hey, this user just logged in into their Office 360 environment from from a country that they never log in from, and that really is not normal. And then we track it back and find out, yes, someone got their credentials. We can go in, actually, you can go in directly into the application and kill all of their sessions. So you revoke all of their Office 365 tokens directly out of MCAS itself. And I'll take a look. I've got a live version of MCAS, so we'll pop that open a little bit. I'll show you a little bit more about that. A few other tools that are really important. One, it is a little bit confusing because most of the time you'll hear this referred to as Azure ATP, but there's actually an on-prem version of Azure ATP called ATA. So if you see ATA, it's basically a on-prem version, so you don't have to use the cloud. Most of our clients, are using the cloud-based version of Azure ATP. And Azure ATP is probably the second most important tool out there after MCAS. And actually, now today, you can integrate the alerts of ATP together with MCAS, so it makes it even better. But ATP works in a different way. And the way that ATP works is it'll actually deploy sensors out to your domain controllers. And those sensors run on all of the domain controllers, and they look for activity which is considered to be a little bit odd. So that would be activities like, something that might indicate a golden ticket attack, something that might indicate someone searching for privileged accounts, doing LDAP queries that maybe aren't normal, out of the ordinary. fact, actually, just a couple hours before this, I had a client where I was researching an LDAP alert that came from ADP because there were some strange searches going on. So that kind of stuff happens, and it gets pushed up from the sensors directly into ATP in the cloud, and then through the ATP console, you can then investigate and do a little bit more research into it. The nice thing about the sensors is that they only send up actionable information up, so they're not just sending a huge amount of data up. That's actually something later when we look at Sentinel, where it's sending all the logs. But ATP itself is intelligent enough to separate, again, that it's that signal to noise ratio, to only show what's useful and send that up into the cloud. For this to work effectively, you need to have a sensor running on all of your domain controllers, because you'll have blind spots if there's activities happening on certain domain controllers where it doesn't work at. And there is, incidentally, there are a couple different versions of ATP. There's what's called Azure ATP. There's also what used to be called Windows Defender ATP, now called Microsoft Defender ATP, because it's not just on Windows now, as well as the Office 365 ATP, and that's part of that overall Microsoft Threat Protection suite itself. Okay, I mentioned Sentinel. This is unfortunately the only one I'm not going to be able to directly demo, because Microsoft doesn't really provide a demo of Sentinel itself. I do use it, but for obvious reasons, I can't show you an active client environment. But just from kind of describing what this is, Sentinel is a SIEM, so that's a security information and event management tool. Which SIEMs are essentially like a consolidated central location for storing a bunch of log data and then alerting and providing actions and being able for you to do hunting and investigation directly within that. So what it does is it takes your logs from your firewalls, it takes your syslogs from your routers and your other services, and consolidates them into a central location. So the clients that we have using this also generally what they do is they will deploy an agent out to the domain controllers, and it's an additional agent in addition to the ATP sensor, and that pushes up all of the logins. So the audit logs, for example, off a domain controller, those all get pushed up. You also have it, generally you do it for critical file servers and other systems that you want to have that sent. There's a lot of different third parties as well that can integrate and send their logs directly into Sentinel, including if you want to store more than 30 days worth of the Azure logs, you can have those automatically sent into Sentinel itself. So from a perspective of being able to identify, for example, you see on the slide, it shows potential malicious events. When we have a client that sends their firewall logs to it, and the firewall logs will pinpoint based on the GPS coordinates where attacks come from. And so you get these great heat maps about who's attacking you, where and when. And that allows you to do investigations. Go, why is it that I'm being attacked, a huge amount of attacks from this location right now? And you dive into more detail. In addition, there's a lot of built-in dashboards, built-in hunting. If you look, you can see there's a little hunting tab there. That's one of my favorite ones. It goes in and it looks for situations which it considers to be a little bit odd. So you can search for users that have the specific type of OS. They're doing queries which normally are only associated with malware tools, and so they have that built-in intelligence. Sentinel is one of the ones, though, that from a licensing perspective, you basically are paying for the amount of data you ingest and for how long you retain it. And data ingestion is generally the highest cost. I'd say maybe 80% of the cost, depending on how long you want to keep your data. But when you compare it to other platforms like Elk and things like that, it ends up being, at least in the cost comparisons I've done, cheaper. Okay, a few other tools. One of the ones I wanted to talk about, I mentioned the people's problems with passwords. And, this goes back really to NT4 days. And unfortunately, natively out of the box, Microsoft really hasn't done too much to improve the password situation. What are there, there's a lot of reasons for that, but for decades now, we've been stuck with saying, hey, we can have passwords this long, we can do a certain amount of, the passwords can be have an uppercase, lowercase, etc. But you can't get really sophisticated with it. You can't say, I don't want to use these specific passwords. I don't want to use passwords that are known, bad passwords that are part of these dark web databases, and I don't want people reusing their names or the name of the company. You can't do that natively. Now, there have been some third parties that have been out there for years that have allowed that, but Microsoft actually even has a tool right now called Azure AD Password Protection, which is basically a password filter DLL that you run on your domain controllers. And that then allows you to set specific types of complexity requirements. So you can now check against dark web databases for hacked passwords. You can make sure that they're not including their name in it. You can make sure that they're not including the company name. So, put in those type of restrictions. You have a lot more complexity with what you can do with it. It does, however, need to be running on every domain controller as well, because again, same type of thing as the ATP sensor. You may have blind spots if you don't actually if you don't put it on all your domain controllers, and then someone could change their password on one using one of the old formats. So in other words, it's not going to look at existing passwords and say this is not compliant. Okay, I mentioned MFA. If you take anything out of this presentation, and even if you don't use any of the tools, I highly, highly recommend you enable MFA for all of your users as soon as you possibly can, because the type of hacks that I talked about, they almost all start with somebody clicking on a link, a phishing attack, somebody downloading the wrong thing, somebody entering their credentials. You got to feel bad for the end user, because it's tough. They're trying to do their job. They don't want to be bothered with IT. They just want something that they can easily remember. And sometimes people forget passwords, so they do things that that make it easier for them. But what ends up happening is that username and password are not enough nowadays. It's way too easy for people to log in and hack someone. That's where you need that additional factor. And natively within Office 365, you have the cloud MFA built in, which means that you can set someone up for multi-factor. You can enable it on their account. And at that point, they have to enter username and password, but they also have to enter in that third factor. Now, that can be an app on your phone, like the Microsoft or the Google Authenticator apps, or it can be a text message that's sent down to you. The app itself is a little more secure, by the way, just through something called SIM hijacking, where someone can call up your phone company and have the SIM switched over to theirs and then get a multi-factor. But for the most part, it's definitely it's a lot better. Some of the Microsoft stuff that I've seen says it mitigates somewhere around 99% of the hacks just enabling MFA alone. I mentioned, by the way, also there's something called Azure MFA, which is a service that you can run internally. So you can actually do that to provide MFA for internal services as well as providing for the cloud-based MFA. So there's a couple different options. Okay, if you haven't already turned it on within your Azure environment, or if let's say your Azure environment is new and you're just starting to set up the admin side of things, I highly recommend you take a look at something called PIM, Privileged Identity Management. And what PIM is it's a tool that allows you to turn on your admin rights only when you need your admin rights. So in other words, by default, nobody is an admin, or very few people. You actually have a few things, what are called break glass accounts. There's some backdoor accounts, what have you. But everybody's normal admin accounts, when they come into work in the morning, they have to then request their, let's say, the global admin rights or the help desk admin rights or whatever it is that they need to do within Azure. And that has to go through a workflow. Now, that workflow could be something as simple as just logging it, so it automatically requests it. Of course, that's the least secure option. Or it could be an option where you actually have to have someone approve it. So it could be a supervisor, it could be a peer, someone has to go through and approve that. That way, if suddenly someone, if there's someone's doing a request at 2 a.m. in the morning to set their admin rights, you may look at that a little bit more skeptically than if someone's there in the middle of the day doing their regular job. So PIM itself, one of the first things with the clients, we have this set up. I go in the morning, I request it, I get it approved. I can then go in for up to 10 hours, which is the maximum amount of time, or I can change the duration, and I specify in the notes exactly why I'm doing specific things. So this is really the new model in terms of admin access, not just for the cloud, but also on-prem. And Microsoft actually has a tool to do this on-prem. Confusingly enough, it's not called PIM, it's called PAM, which stands for Privileged Access Management instead of Privileged Identity Management. But PIM and PAM, PIM being the online version, And PAM being the on-prem version. Again, in true Microsoft fashion, we have multiple acronyms for this. PAM itself is basically the same concept, but on an on-prem basis. And what's really interesting about the PAM concept is I'm actually estimating that about 5 years in the future, this is really going to be the standard way of setting things up from an admin perspective. And what it does is it latches on to a concept of a bastion environment. So your bastion environment is a forest that's set up that only has a one-way trust from your corporate domain into that bastion environment. So the bastion doesn't trust corporate, but corporate trusts bastion. And your admin accounts are all stored in the bastion environment. And the idea is that then when someone needs to do something, let's say you need to do something that requires domain admin or schema admin or whatever it is, they go in and they need to have their bastion account added as a member of the AD group. Let's say it's domain admin again or some other group. It gets added as a member of that group, and then they can do their tasks. Microsoft has a tool, again, called PAM, that automates that process. So it creates a portal. That portal allows you to request that. After you request it, it automatically moves that user account for a short period of time. It gives them a time bomb version of that ticket. They then get added into the group. They then can go and do what it is that they needed to do. But that way, the lateral attacks are much more difficult to accomplish. So if someone hacks that laptop and that admin had logged into it, well, they're no longer an admin at the time that the hacker gets in, or hopefully they're not an admin. Now, again, Bastion can be done with or without PAM, but PAM just, again, automates that process. There's other tools that also use environments like that. But again, I would think that in the very near future, we're going to see things like that, because the reality is that Microsoft has certain best practices around how to set up your AD forest. And a lot of times organizations get to this point where they go, well, this application doesn't support this, this application doesn't support this, and they have to wait until they get it up to the Microsoft Gold standard. You rarely have to do that with Bastion. When we set up Bastion, it's like we've got no GUIs. This is all the domain controllers are set up where they're hardened to the highest standards. They're all using it's all locked down. It's in a specific firewall segment where only certain people can get in. So you can actually set up that Bastion forest to the best practice security without worrying that it's going to sabotage your apps within the corporate environment itself. Okay, a couple other tools to mention here. One is called Azure Information Protection. And this, it sounded like coming in late on the session that we just had that you just came in. If you were viewing the previous session, there was a session on this. But Azure Information Protection really is about controlling what happens to the data after it's been accessed. So for many decades, we've been very, very good about controlling who has access to data. SharePoint does that really well. You have to be this user to get into it. But what happens after that user downloads that data, after they access that confidential stuff that's out there? Well, in the past, it's very difficult to control having that user then take that data and distribute it out there, or copy it, put it on their laptop, their personal laptop, which wasn't encrypted, that gets stolen, or nefariously send it off to the next person. This is kind of like the Snowden example. You just copy things onto the thumb drive, take them away. Information protection, Azure Information Protection helps to control what happens to that data. So to put encryption and locks in place to prevent you from forwarding an email, to prevent you from doing like en masse downloading of data. Sure, someone can whip out their phone, take a picture of the screen, but I mentioned that most of this stuff is accidental. So if you have the information protection, if you have Azure Rights Management Services in place, you can actually better control that type of stuff. And you can, even if someone does accidentally overshare something, the user won't be able to get into it because the information protection protocols are in place. Okay, another tool to mention is called Azure Security Center, and this is really essentially a suite of tools built into Azure. It's also a suite that is evolving on a regular basis. So if you haven't taken a look at this recently, I highly recommend that you go in and look at it. I will talk about licensing in a second because some of the coolest things I'm talking about do require additional licenses. But keep in mind there is a free tier of Azure Security Center that allows you to do a certain amount of things, including get your secure score and go in and do a certain amount of remediation. Your secure score itself is something, if you haven't taken a look at it, I highly recommend you take a look at it because it'll give you a list of exactly what you can do to improve your security score. Things like enable MFA for all the users, or or encrypt your your virtual machine, the hard drives, if they're not encrypted. Now there are additional things that you can do above and beyond. There's a standard tier of Security Center, and I'll give you. There's a matrix at the end where I talk about this here. But I wanted to well, that's the matrix. This took me a while to kind of put together, because it's not necessarily that obvious, and this isn't in one central location. So I had to kind of dive into detail. And by the way, of course, I'm listing, if you're coming internationally, I'm listing, of course, US dollars amount. It will vary based on your location. And those dollar amounts also vary over time as well, too. I don't always go through and update them. So keep that in mind. If you're a nonprofit as well, too, it'll be different. But that gives you kind of the general feel of what Microsoft charges for some of these various licenses. And you can go out, for example, and get access to MCAS by buying what's called Azure AD Premium P2 licenses, or you can get it included as part of, let's say, Microsoft 365 E5, which includes a P2 as part of it. So it kind of gives you a general idea. Of course, Microsoft tries to push you to get an E5. You gain access to a lot of that. But again, a lot of the coolest stuff that we're talking about, the ATP, the MCAS, the PIM-PAM, MIM, those are part of either an AD Premium P2 license or an E5 license. So I've got a kind of a sample demo here, a demo tenancy here, and I'm going to show you a little bit of what I'm talking about here. Now, unfortunately, this really isn't what a real environment would look like. You'd have a lot rich information in here, but in some of these Microsoft demos, Microsoft tended to preload a few of these things with some of the some kind of sample hacks. They tried to hack it and take a look at it. So starting with looking at cloud app security, I can see, for example, hey, guess what? There's an app that's out there, but T-Mobile was breached on this particular date. What's interesting about this as well, too, is they will actually scan the database and look for any of your domain names showing up in the database. So you can see, hey, I noticed, I guess Bob at companyabc.com was one of the usernames as part of this database. I better get Bob to change his password because maybe his password was compromised as part of that. Or I can take a look and say, oh, guess what? It looks like someone tried to share, the Northwind customer data spreadsheet. And I know this is highly confidential. No one wants Northwind's IP to get out there. But yeah, poor Megan accidentally flipped a switch on the DLP policy here. So I can get an idea of what's out there, as well as I can kind of take a look at, what apps are out there, and how does Microsoft score these apps? It's actually interesting. Microsoft will go into detail and say, okay, this particular actually funny that IIS is scored a 10. We won't talk about that. But we go into these individual ones here. Salesforce, for example, is scored a 9. We can take a look at company usage of this particular application. Now, of course, in my sample tenancy, I'd be surprised if I had anybody using Salesforce. Well, surprised, shockingly enough. Maybe they preloaded this when they put this in the demo, the tenancy. But you can kind of get a feel for, yeah, they did. Go Microsoft. So this actually shows you, some of the users internally which are using this, and you can actually tie this into not just IP addresses, but individual users as well that may have been using this particular tool, in this case, Salesforce. So if Salesforce ever has a hack, I can go back to those users. I can take a look at my top 100 users and say, hey, guess what? We've got a problem. Again, it'll show us if those particular users have been hacked or not. Again, highly useful. This just from the perspective of understanding what users are using out there, the alerts that get generated by those users in the dashboard itself. Those are really critical, and you can actually go in and create what they call a cloud discovery report. That's very nice visuals for management to take a look at. And take a look at different alerts. Again, this would be a lot richer information that shows up here if we were using a real one. Microsoft Defender Security Center, Defender ATP. These runs, the Defender ATP is actually an agent that runs on each individual workstation. I mentioned the Azure ATP component, the higher level Microsoft Defender Threat Protection tool suite. The Microsoft Defender ATP is an individual agent. Think of it like an anti-malware agent that runs on all of your workstations. So what this will do is it will look for problems on the individual workstation itself. So in this case, I can see we had a problem, right? We had on this particular device, again, this is just a sample one that Microsoft did. There was a process injection that was going on. So it was some kind of defensive invasion. It kicked off a PowerShell script, which is a lot of ways that these things try to hide themselves by looking like they're just some specific PowerShell script that's going on here. And really, what this was is this was kind of a lateral move that they tried to make from one workstation to the next. So the workstation automatically terminated that process once it saw it, and so I can tell that it never went beyond this particular workstation itself. I could see, however, if it managed to make it off of it, it'll actually sometimes say, if it's a brand new attack, something that it hasn't seen before, to say this looks suspicious. This user then went from this location to the next location, and you can kind of like track down where users went after they clicked on a specific location. You can see user activity. Actually, that's something I didn't even show as well here from the user page. Let's see if I can pull that up. I think Megan is the one we want to take a look at. A lot of these, well, let's look at this one. Yeah. I don't think, they don't have in the demo, they don't have the ATP integration. That's too bad. There's in the ATP integration, you actually get this page where you can see the user, and then you can go in and see all their activity, both on-prem and in the cloud. Okay, so let's see, what else do I want to show here? Got a few minutes left before questions. ATP, this is the investigation dashboard within the Microsoft Security Center. So you can actually see what's going on in this case because they're using Exchange Online. You can kind of see all the messages that are being scanned and the different threats that were stopped as part of that. Gives you a better understanding of what it is you can do within the Security Center. I can do threat investigations from within here. Again, nothing going on within this tenancy. I mentioned the secure score. Microsoft's little demo tenancy doesn't have a very high secure score here. Surprisingly, though, a lot of people don't really have that high of a score, so 18% is not terrible. But let's say I want to go through and improve this. I can then just go through the actions that are out there. So turn on MFA first for your admins. Definitely for your admins, you want to turn those on first. Start to turn on policies, turn on customer lockbox, restrict roles, and then it gives you an idea of what your points, if your points go up and down. If you're got TLS, if you fix TLS issues, if you put DLS policies in place, or if you don't, they may even rescore you as you go along, and you can take a look at your history and your different metrics as things go through here. Okay. That was the secure score, and I mentioned the inside dashboard. So let me go back into here. Okay, once again, these are the various tools that I mentioned and the various rough prices that are out there. So I do have a few minutes left here, 13 minutes or so, so I will open it up for questions. I guess, Al, you're looking at the questions queue. I've put the QR codes. Those just correspond to those speaker feedback forms as well there. So please enter your speaker feedback as well as the overall event feedback. It's great for the organizers to get an understanding of what it is that people liked, what worked, what didn't work. And if you do need to reach out to me after this event, you can reach out to my business, CCO. We're at cco.com, especially if you're Bay Area focused. We do a lot of work with clients in the Bay Area. I'm on Twitter as well as you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I do have a travel blog. I haven't maintained it in a few years, but it's called sharingtheglobe.com if you're curious about a few of the other locations I've been to around the world. I have around, I think it's 17 countries left to visit in the world out of the 193 that are out there. So if you have any questions about, great places to visit, stuff like that, traveling is definitely a passion of mine, and I hope to hit the last country sometime within the next 2 years. Of course, obviously focusing on health over the next year or so, and I hope everybody that's out there is staying happy and healthy as well during these times. So as well, I will make these slides available on SlideShare, and I'll give them to the organizers. So that said, I'll turn it over to Al for some if there's any questions.
Thanks, Mike. And strangely enough, that slide that you put together around pricing and what options are available,
yeah,
ping me. I can't find your email address. I've actually got the one from Microsoft in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, it would be nice if they had provided that. But yeah, that actually, I will ping you, Al. That's
yeah. A mate of mine asked me about default classifications for labels and is it a P1 or a P2 plan? And I said, what are you talking about? And he mailed me a spreadsheet. And
wow.
and this was literally 2 days ago. That Microsoft 365 compliance licensing comparison.
Oh, that's fantastic. I wonder.
Gold,
Yeah,
pure gold.
Yeah, no, that's it's hard to. I hope you don't get in trouble. We're recording this, but yeah, no, that's cool. Appreciate that.
Well, it's not confidential, so.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I always thought, I don't know, they always kept those close to their chest, so I always thought, well, if not confidential, they at least don't put it.
I think this says that it is confidential. Just a few questions from my side. There was one. There's three questions. Well, there's two. Is MCAS set up in the Microsoft demo tenants? Yes, Phil, it is. It depends on what you spin up. And then also, what basis does Microsoft use to score CD apps? Is that conditional access apps or MCAS apps?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm assuming they mean conditional access policies for MFA.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I can't say that Microsoft's score is perfect on this because, of course, you can have a conditional access policy in place that forces MFA for certain conditions for those users. From what I've seen in the secure score in the clients where I have both conditional access policies and MFA turned on, is that they don't really give you full credit until MFA is turned on and is essentially enforced for those users. Interestingly enough, though, they do give you, you can create your own kind of form of conditional access policy directly within when you have MFA turned on for a user by saying that you're not doing MFA for certain IP addresses, like IP addresses that are in your home range, but you still get credit for that. So is the secure score perfect? I don't think so, because, you know, the reality is that, you know, if somebody shows up, a lot of times if they suddenly log in from a different country, it's going to ask them for MFA, even if MFA is not turned on, because they have a conditional access policy in place. Yeah,
it was actually for cloud discovery.
Oh, for cloud discovery.
On the MCAS side, I think.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure how they, to be completely honest with you, I'm not sure how they score that on the cloud discovery perspective. It is curious. It's something maybe I can follow up with somebody at Microsoft. But whether or not they're using the conditional access policies to score, they might have been talking. I think they're talking about the actual apps themselves. These apps like this score.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is Microsoft's secret sauce, to be completely honest. I mean, when you look into it a little bit more detail, they give you a little bit of more information about exactly what's going on here. Like, okay, if the app itself supports MFA or not, it looks like this one doesn't. Whether or not they can upload data, you know, that's how it kind of defines whether or not it's a good one. Oh, Zlatan will be happy to know AWS is a 10.
Interestingly enough, I referenced him in an article today about community and you when you came out. I think it was 2009 when we had that first SharePoint Saturday. Just coming back to PIM and PAM, right? Like TIM and TAM. Privileged identity. I laughed when you carried on about that.
I saw you laughing. I didn't hear it, but I saw it. Yeah,
but
yeah.
Also,
the PIM PAM Slam. That's for anyone from Australia, New Zealand.
It's also just enough access and just in time access, right? Which works in conjunction with PIM and PAM. So in the older, before Microsoft implemented, you had stuff like Ping that actually managed it quite well, where you'd get elevated privileges for a specific user for a period of time to perform some administrative tasks. And I think that's also important because you mentioned someone's got global admin rights, and with a phishing attack, they've got the details, or they spoofed an AP and they're in, and they've got that they're in, right? And then you can do some sort of token, some sort of ticketing on the back end where you've got access indefinitely. And rightfully said, if it's one thing that you do, switch on MFA.
Yeah,
it's the easiest thing, and it's the most effective thing out of all the other things that you do.
Yeah, it is quite easy to set it up for the end users now. They've made it, the wizard is pretty straightforward. You know, we've got a couple clients right now where we're rolling it out en masse, and honestly, the rollouts go pretty smoothly as long as the, you know, the end users are prepared for what's going to happen. You know, they log in, they enter proper username and password, and then it says, hey, we need a little bit of additional information now, and it'll walk them through that process. Yeah. So yeah, if you haven't done it, please do it.
Yeah. There's a few caveats on MFA, especially on where you enable it from. So, and it depends on the license that you have. So if you're in the M365 admin center and you flip the MFA there's also a security baseline that you can enable that will push down modern authentication, which I think is also important, because when attackers get in, that's really where they get in too, right? They will go and look at IMAP and SMTP and POP3 and actually start sending mails from your account. If you flip the switch for modern auth, which is part of the baseline security stuff, the users or the attacker won't be able to get in the traditional way. We've actually had that happen to one of our customer tenants because they did not have MFA enabled. It's a simple sort of phishing attack. Click on the link, put in your credentials, and boom, they're in. Luckily, it was a generic user, so they had no permissions. But there are a few caveats when you switch that modern auth on, specifically for Exchange. There's another tick box that's hidden in the admin center around modern auth, not just from that baseline security side. And you're going to have to tick that box as well, not just blanket. And it's synonymous with the stuff that you were talking about, AIP and sensitivity labels, how they come through for DLP policies. There's AIP with unified labeling. There's also conditional access in Azure, and then there's also conditional access that sits inside of M365. And then there's also Azure AD identity protection, which adds another level of confusion to everything that everyone has been talking about. So yeah, it's kind of difficult to get that schedule right, or that when it happens and how it happens, and you can't just enforce right now. You have to wait a few hours for it to for it to roll out. So people just need to be patient when they flip the switch as well. It's not just immediate.
Yeah, that's true as well. I mean, you hit on a few key points as well too. Is that most hacks, I think it's something like 80% plus, use some of the deprecated protocols or some of the older protocols, because you know the newer stuff is built much more securely. So if you have older things turned on, you know, I mean, you mentioned IMAP, but even you know some of the older authentication to Office 365, you know, the pre-modern auth stuff, that is one possible attack vector for people to get in. And of course, turning modern auth on as well too. The great side benefit of that is that users get prompted much less often for, you know, the pop-ups where they have to enter their credentials again. I know that turned people off from MFA originally when it kind of was first coming off, as people were getting lots of unnecessary prompts. If modern auth is properly implemented and you have the right client versions and what have you, especially today, you don't see that. You just get the authenticated once, and then that authentication token is good. I was reading into it. It's actually it's good for an hour, but you get a refresh token. The refresh token, as long as you're in there at least once every 14 days, it'll continue to go for up to 90 days, and then 90 days is the max, and then it'll ask you to authenticate again. So all in all, though, not that bad. I mean, if you consider someone logging in from home, they get that refresh token. They can continue to use it, especially if they're active in the system for up to 3 months.
Yeah. Any conversation around app passwords? Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to not, of course, use them unless we need to. The app password is essentially a backdoor into it. We do, though, generally make them available to user population because there are always those applications which don't support MFA. But again, that's another attack vector path into someone's account is via those app passwords. So if at all possible, try not to use them because you know they're not perfect. Again, it's bypassing MFA.
Yeah. So that is a caveat when using app passwords. So make sure that you do not switch that on for your tenant.
Yeah, exactly. Any
Okay,
other
I think
questions in the queue?
no, there's nothing else. I answered some as they came through.
What time is it there, man?
It is 2 minutes to 10 p.m.
Ah,
So
getting late.
it's still early.
I guess early for you. Okay.
All right,
All right.
everyone. I think that's a wrap from Mike's side. Cool session. And like one of the people said on the call, great presentation. I never knew Microsoft had so many security options. Yeah, ATP versus ATA versus Azure ATA.
I think the naming conventions can get a little better, right? Especially when we get into that pim pam slam stuff area. That's bad. But yeah, you know, I eventually they'll probably rename it to just Microsoft Security 365 or something. It'll be everything included. But yeah, you know, we'll see. One day I'll have to change all my